think about certain processes. Anyway, we go. It looks good.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
I did that out.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah. The only thing we could do.
How much of me do you have above the waist? Are my hands in now?
The microphone's
sir.
not.
I'd like.
Right
Okay.
about the V of your neck.
Okay.
And
Good. So I can fiddle with my hands and I won't bother. Okay.
Please feel comfortable in that regard. Okay. Well, we're running.
rolling.
Excellent. All right. First of all, thanks again for having us.
My pleasure.
Appreciate it. It's an honor to talk with you.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you.
I'd like to start by asking you to, similar to what we did in the phone, to give a kind of brief thumbnail of how it is that you come to the work. I mean, I think one of the most important things for people to understand before they go on to, listen to what it is you've discovered in your work is why do you do it? Where came the inspiration inside of you to put your mind into this space and learn it?
Right. Well, I was trained in graduate school as a psycholinguist. So I came into my first professional job really interested in language, not interested in reading. It's interesting that in the traditional look at language, the kind that I was trained in, reading is considered a trivial aspect of language. It's, language has syntax, phonology, morphology, pragmatics. It's got a lot of complexity, and reading is just simple. You just look at the words, and it's... So the fact is that no one was studying reading in my tradition. I got interested in it. I can remember the day fairly well. I had gone to a conference. I can no longer remember which conference it was. It was in Philadelphia. There's a pretty good chance it was either APA or Eastern Psychological Association or Society for Child Development. We could actually check that if I could remember. But some graduate students and I got involved in a conversation because we had heard a paper at the conference about reading, and we started a conversation that went, what is it that one needs to know about reading skill? Why is it that some children are not as good at reading as others? And we kicked some ideas around, and they were the kind of ideas that psycholinguists have, like parsing might be a problem for poor readers, or semantics might be a problem. And I said, isn't the main thing you do in reading is read words? And I said, I know that doesn't sound quite as exciting as some of the other things we're talking about, but if we're really going to study this, that's where we ought to start. And I started studying that. We all did. Some of my first graduate students and I worked on very basic questions about how word reading differs among children of different reading skill, and the consequences we thought that had for their ability to comprehend what they read. And we worked at that for quite a while. We worked on other things as well, and over the course of my research, I think we have looked at almost every level of language that is relevant for skilled reading. Phonology, phonemic awareness, how words are identified, word meaning, which is something we've picked up again, syntax, text comprehension, learning from text. I'm a little greedy, I guess. I want to try to understand it all at all levels, and I think that's probably a bad strategy for a year or two, but if you've been at it as long as I have, you can move comfortably between one level and another and still learn something that's kind of interesting.
Fascinating. So I appreciate that when, as people that were specializing in the study of language, when they first approach reading, they see it through the carpenters see nails, right? They're looking at it through the mental lenses that they've developed to talk about and discuss and think about language, and not recognizing the distinctive properties of reading, and that you began the process of kind of teasing out the distinctions that would give us the basis for learning into them in new ways. You know?
That's right, and I think in a way it puts you in a category of being a little simplistic, and I think that's the thing I noticed, that others were looking at some rather complex ideas about why children might have trouble reading, often having to do with non-cognitive factors, and I think all those are important. But what I mean by getting categorized as simplistic, there is this view called the simple view of reading, and I suppose I would be one of those who is roughly in that category, which is to say that if you can figure out how language comprehension works, which is the bigger of the two tasks in some ways, and then figure out how word reading works, and when you put those two together, you've got what you need for reading comprehension. I think that story turns out to be not quite complete, but it captures such a big piece of the picture that it's the important piece to try to get right. If you can read words fluently, then you can combine that with whatever it is you know about spoken language, apply your spoken language skills, your comprehension skills, and that will lead to reading comprehension that is at least as good as your listening comprehension. I think it misses some of the story. There's more to it than that, but it's such a big piece that it's worth the focus that it gets in this simple view of reading.
Let's come back, Ray.
It's got to, you had to hide for a minute. So we have better lighting now than we did?
More stable. Yeah, there was some lights shifting outside that we could see affecting the auto settings of the cameras that tried to track the light inside.
Okay.
One of the things I'd like to do, I really appreciate kind of understanding where you're coming from, the caveat about the simple view, and there's a remarkable richness in the array of things that you discuss. I'd like to drill down a little deeper into some of the parts of it. And perhaps what we could start with is comprehension. One of the things that I find that's probably one of the most amazing things, there's a lot of them, is that we don't establish a really good baseline of understanding somebody's listening comprehension ability to regular oral language. And yet we go off to talk about them having reading comprehension problems as if their comprehension problems are exclusive to reading rather than more general. That just seems to be murky and fuzzy in the minds of educators at large. I don't mean to overgeneralize, but that seems really significant to me. I would like you to comment on that to whatever extent you're comfortable with, and then drill into, and let's take a few minutes and just blow up. What do we mean by comprehension?
Well, that's a good point. The people have not paid detailed attention to what it means to have comprehension. I put it this way: comprehension in the reading world has, in fact, collapsed to reading comprehension, not general comprehension. There's not as much work on spoken language comprehension, and people tend not to use that as a bar against which to compare reading comprehension. And I think it does need to be, because on this simple view, you can't expect reading comprehension to be better than listening comprehension in general. In some, there might be some interesting exceptions, but it takes us off on quite a different path.
Become such a reader that you're not dealing with kinds of text and vocabulary that are not in the spoken vocabulary.
That's right. That's right.
That's not the startup curve that we're interested in when we talk about struggling readers.
That's right. That's right. I actually once wrote a probably appropriately neglected paper on people who read better than they listen. Sort of hyperliteracy was the theme of the paper. And if you get to a point that you spend much more of your life reading and writing than you do speaking and listening, you might actually show superior comprehension in reading, because you're in a mode that you're more comfortable with, it's more familiar. But in the mundane case, your general language capabilities, general language comprehension sets the limit on reading comprehension. Comprehension, I think, traditionally has been considered a very big thing. That is, word identification is a little thing, almost trivial in some points of view. Comprehension is a big, kind of amorphous thing. I think that you make progress in science by analyzing pieces and then trying to put them back together. And I think reading science is no different from any other science. We have to decompose comprehension into components that we can understand better. And that's been happening. There was a time when people, especially people in education who were talking about comprehension, were mainly interested in things like, well, prior knowledge, things called schema. So you can't, the kind of knowledge you bring to bear to help you understand a new situation. These things were rather abstract. They were also influenced, I think, by the fact that people were trying to write computer, well, it's essentially intelligent systems that could comprehend. And since the job of getting sentence comprehension was too hard, writing natural language parsers that could really work, the easy thing to do was to make a little toy system that had lots of knowledge built into it, and then it could understand, in a sense of understanding, some sentences in a very restricted domain. It didn't go very far in computational work, and it doesn't go very far in reading science, because there is a part of comprehension that's rather basic, understanding words and understanding sentences. That means understanding how the words fit into the context of the sentence, how the knowledge a reader has about word meanings is fitted into the sentence that's being currently read, how the mental representation of these words that have to stick around in the mind while the child reads the rest of the text come to play when the rest of the text is read. All of these are problems that can be analyzed as components. You have to put them back together at some point, so that people, the common sense idea of comprehension, which is a global concept, then can be readdressed. But we've made progress, I think, in reading comprehension by having broken the problem down, studying the pieces. So we know quite a bit about simple sentence comprehension, actually. It's interesting that work has not come from people doing reading, but from the tradition I came from, the psycholinguistic tradition. We know quite a bit about that, and from a reading point of view, the controversies in that field are rather, they're esoteric. I find them interesting, but things about exactly when different kinds of knowledge can become available during sentence comprehension, or whether the natural tendencies of a parser can be affected by knowledge of different kinds. All that's rather interesting, and I think there's a big body of work that tells us quite a bit about how that works. There's a pretty big body of work that now tells us how people understand and represent sentences, and how knowledge influences make a difference, and how memory plays a role. So again, progress has been made by breaking the bigger comprehension problem down into pieces, and I don't think it's being put back together yet. One of the things that strikes me as someone who's worked both at the sentence level at parsing and at the discourse level for whole text is how completely disconnected those two research communities are. Maybe not completely, but 99%. The people who work at sentence comprehension do not attend very much to discourse comprehension, text comprehension. The text comprehension community sort of picks up where sentence understanding leaves off, and their work is not terribly well informed by that. But on the other hand, that's part of the strategy. I said it was a good one, right? Break the problem down into this piece and that piece, and you need to do that to make progress on each piece. But you also need to put them back together. So, for example, a consequence of that, I think, is that when we take a look at children's comprehension and notice that some children have trouble comprehending, the educational community will tend to look at large questions of text comprehension. The child might have trouble understanding the text, might fail to make inferences that are needed, for example, or might fail to exercise metacognition, that is to say, pay attention to what he or she is understanding. And all of that work goes on, often it goes on, without really asking, what is the child understanding at the moment he or she is reading a sentence, one word at a time, and trying to put together word meanings into sentence meanings. That part of the process is essentially taken for granted. So I think we don't know about the causes of reading comprehension failure. In principle, there are as many causes of comprehension problems as there are components to this big thing we call comprehension. And people have tended not only to just work on one, but to not assess the others. So that because the process is cascaded in the sense of, to understand a sentence, you have to understand the word. To understand the text, you have to understand the sentence. To understand all of that, you have to apply knowledge when it's relevant. You can observe the consequences of a word level problem way downstream at the text level. That cascading process makes it important for people to try to assess the lower as well as the upper parts of that.
Yeah, we've talked to a number of people that get on the significance of difficulties associated with it. We talk about that language processing is this incredible chain, and that a fault anywhere along that's going to create a stutter that radiates throughout it and disturbs the processing ecology, efficiency, throughput of the system as a whole. And yet, there does seem to be, not necessarily at the kind of what's theoretically possibly interrupting comprehension, but what is in the aggregate pattern of what we can see with most children causing comprehension problems. There seems to be a sluggishness in the lower level processing having to do with getting to word recognition. And that, as we talked about on the phone, I'd like to cycle back on this, whether it's Stennevich's interactive or compensatory model or other ways of describing that, this notion that if you're burning too much processing energy and too much time, perhaps is more important, in getting letters into sounds, into word recognition, then you're missing the window in time, or you don't have enough leftover brain resources to get the meaning. Drill into that space with me wherever you're comfortable.
Right. Well, that actually was my original argument here was something I called verbal efficiency theory, which is exactly the idea that a bottleneck in comprehension, a typical bottleneck, and there can be more than one, but a typical bottleneck for comprehension is fluent word identification. Sometimes we call it automatic word identification, but because that term's a little, it's maybe a stronger standard, but easy, facile, fluent, rapid, effort-free, all of these characteristics, word identification enables the reader to put together words into messages, and that's the point of reading. You try to get a message out of sentences. And if there is a limitation on word recognition such that it is effortful, that just means that there are fewer mental resources available exactly when they're needed, by the way, which is the next word, so that you can integrate what you've just read with the next word. We have limited memory systems. All humans are blessed with this limitation. And cognitive life is full of juggling information so that we can reduce the stress on this limited system that we have. And diverting attention to something outside the sentence you're reading, for example, will cause a disruption. Having difficulty with the word will cause a disruption. So fluency at the word level has a big impact. If you can do it at low cost, if you can recognize a word in a quarter of a second and not have to stumble over it, you're ahead. And if you are slow and effortful, your comprehension is at risk. And I think that argument has stood the test of time. I think everyone now tends to agree with it in one form or another. There's more to it than that. There's certainly more to comprehension than being able to read the words fluently. But if you don't read the words fluently, that is a significant bottleneck.
So necessary but insufficient in the overall strap up to comprehension is
Sure.
getting these words to
Sure.
that level.
Sure.
What you said that's really interesting. We're trying to get at this from two different angles of view, which we touched on the phone. One having to do with the code processing, how we get from this code to sound to word recognition on one side. On the other side, what happens to those children that experience such protracted confusion, frustration, that now in parallel to whatever work they're able to do or trying to do in word recognition, they're starting to become self-conscious. They're starting to become uncomfortably self-aware of how difficult this is, and that concurrent occupation in mind is draining resources back to the same point that you were just. Oops. Ooh. Sorry about that.
I got it.
Fortunately, you weren't talking. Draining resources in a way that's, having a similar net effect in terms of distracting the brain from doing the work to get to the comprehension. So.
Yeah, well, I am absolutely sure that that's exactly the same problem in a more general problem, right? What you're pointing to is if you're trying to understand what you read and you have interference from any source, it can be difficulty in recognizing words. It can be an emotional reaction that keeps you essentially off task or inhibits the understanding and the attention, especially the attention that you're trying to devote. Sure. I have to say, that's one of the few things I personally have not studied. So I do not know from my own research how the frustration of poor reading further interferes with the ability to read, but it certainly must do that.
Good, thank you. I appreciate the caveat too. One of the things we're doing with neuroscientists that we're talking to is how do we get the triggering of affect, the emotional triggering of affect, and see its interruption, its interference with ongoing entrainment of cognitive tasks, and stick that in, bring both of those lenses to bear on the stutter we hear and see in a reader as they're dealing with different levels of complexity in the code.
That's a great thing to understand. That's frontiers as far as I'm concerned. Frontiers of science, where people are, and they have been, people starting to look at emotion with cognition. And I think the brain has plenty of neurons to have feelings and read words at the same time. So I don't think that's it. But if there is, it is possible that there's a sort of an inhibition of processing that comes from affective arousal that basically activates some areas and inhibits areas that are trying to do the work of reading. Sure, that's possible.
Yeah, and it's just a matter of, it's a crude analogy, but one of the ones that we play with and bring people out is that, it's like the stutter in your computer when you overload it with more things to do than it can do in time and still seem like it's ahead of you.
Well, there's another side to that though, and that is what gets a reader happy. And I'm reminded of one of the things I ran into when I first started doing this was what I saw as kind of a prejudice against children reading words in isolation and learning to decode, because my experience was that children can get very excited when they don't know how to read and can suddenly crack the code. When you see a kid figure out how to pronounce this letter string as this word, you can actually see the excitement. So there's the other side of affect. There's a positive affect that can maybe push the cycle forward.
Right. Well, we described it, and this is where your work kind of meets some of what Stannett is saying with Matthew effects, in the sense that there is this positive ratcheting, bootstrapping up, or there's this downward negative spiral.
Yeah.
And the downward negative spiral can come from any number of directions.
It sure would be nice to be on the upward spiral most of the time, and the idea that the rich get rich and the poor get poor is, I think, now firmly established in everybody's belief system about reading. But I'm not sure we know much more about it except the level of aphorism and biblical quotation. I think there's a lot more underlying that, and it's actually a serious scientific problem, because everyone can undergo a certain amount of frustration, and the question is how how debilitating that is. What can bring a child out of it? You see children have a bad day. What about the next day? You know, is the next day a bad day?
Right.
That's
this is. I mean, what we're interested in is understanding the child's almost from birth trajectory of intersect with the challenges involved in reading, right? Which have both language foundational side dimensions as well as you might call self-strength, the ability to handle a certain level of frustration and confusion before shaming out, before going into some kind of negative, self-talk or dissipative self-reflection that's interfering with that process.
Right.
So that's exactly what we're interested in, and you're right. I mean, I think that there's a lot of good metaphors here. We don't have a good understanding of the mechanisms and the level that we need to.
Right, but we do know from work that has nothing to do with reading that positive reinforcement, encouragement, making kids feel proud of their achievements are going to go a big way, and there should be a lot of opportunities to let kids know that they're doing okay, and they should feel the reward and the fun of reading words that they couldn't read before. So.
Right. And you can't fool them.
You can't fool them.
One of the things that all the self-esteem work has shown us is that we can stand there with our air pump and try to pump up their self-esteem, but when they get to the thing,
right? Yes, it's got to be built on reality. They have to know that they know. The real satisfaction comes from not someone telling you that you've done well, but from your knowing that you've done well.
Which means that you're on some path of actually getting feedback that you're achieving, that it's working, as opposed to a feel-good illusion that will last for a while. It can training wheels you for a bit, but
right.
You can't substitute.
Right.
Let's go back to some of the other piece parts. We talked about comprehension, and that got beautifully complex. I mean, I really like where we went with it. I'm trying to think of if you were talking to a room full of second grade teachers, and the question was, "What is comprehension, Dr. Perfetti?" What would your quick response to that be? As quick as you'd feel comfortable with without being.
Understanding messages in text. Certainly, a second grade teacher isn't asking me about comprehension in general. She's asking me about reading comprehension. So the answer is getting a message out of a text. Not just any old message, by the way, but the message that whoever wrote the text put in there. I mean, it's the meaning, in fact, is in the text, not just in someone's head.
Right.
And
it's an interaction.
I'm willing to
some facsimile of the intention.
Sure. There's always an interaction between a mind and a text, such that the mind has taken account of some message that before the reading occurred wasn't there. Yes, interaction. But I think we have to be careful about buying into enthusiastically to suggestions that meaning is something totally constructed. I kind of recoil a little bit when someone starts talking about constructivism and construction of meaning. I'm willing to understand that in a particular way that I think makes sense, which is something like you do combine what you know with a text representation to construct a richer understanding of that text. But it does begin, as far as reading is concerned, with what is in the text. That's where meaning, a sentence can mean this, or a sentence can mean that. It can be ambiguous. It can have a number of different interpretations, but it can't be used to mean just any old thing. I mean, that's a nice spring might somehow refer to the thing that's in my mattress or the weather of April, but it can't be used to mean there's a deer across the street. And there's a difference between hallucinating and reading.
Right. Excellent. Good. I appreciate your distinction. Have you ever encountered David Bohm's work on the relationship between meaning and information?
Not sure. I would need more cues. I guess the name doesn't mean quite a lot to me. But
all right. Somebody you might appreciate it at some point. I'm sure that would be. I want to move from comprehension at this more global level back to word recognition and talk about how we get to word recognition from this code. You said something before that was really interesting, and one of the themes that we really want to drill into, which had to do with, well, you know, if people are getting the word, they're recognizing the word in something less than a second, a quarter of a second, I believe you said, right? And they're in good shape. If it's taking them much longer than that, then they're in some danger with respect to whether comprehension is going to occur. That's what makes reading so unique in my sense of things, and what we're trying to bring out is that spelling and mathematics and so many other artificial code level things that humans learn to do when they're young, is some time to think about it. That's different than it seems to be in the case of reading. This construction process has to happen at this incredible speed. What else can we say about, you know, from the recognition of letters, the stream of letters, to the recognition of words in the mind? Where do you want to go in there?
Okay, yeah, well, I've got a couple things to say about several things you said, though. One, on speed. You know, it doesn't take 250 milliseconds for a skilled reader to recognize a word. That's how long it takes, plus or minus 100 milliseconds either way, for the eye to rest on a word and get something out of it and then move on. But it looks like it takes only about 50 milliseconds out of that quarter of a second to really identify the word. Didn't have to move your eyes. You could recognize in a second, according to that arithmetic, about 20 words. It wouldn't be much fun to read that way, but I think that's how fast you want to think about our ability to read words. Now, but another thing is, it's not getting the code is not always about speed. It is about getting the code in reading. I mean, speed is really important. But think about a child who is just learning to read and doing what's called invented spelling. I think that's the most clear demonstration of code use, code production, code creating. A child can write letters. Once they know the alphabet and they notice that the alphabet letters have sounds in them, they will write things down, and the spellings will be wrong from an adult point of view, but they'll have sounds in them. And there are marvelous examples of this all over the place. I probably, like a lot of us, I develop samples from my daughters when they were pre-literate, when they were age 5. They're now 8 and 11, and so they're way beyond that. But I still have them. And when I teach about reading, I show how my girls wrote complete essays with, complete essays, 2 or 3 sentences, with half the words missing, but spelled in a way that makes it really clear that inside those spellings, there's an idea of the sounds. So that's an example, I think, of code creation. Time's not an issue there. That's exactly where you ought to be. Time is only an issue at high levels of practice. When you're suddenly, say in the 4th grade, it can be sooner than that, when you're suddenly facing high-density texts and you've got to plow through a text and really get some messages out of there, and you're not just reading a few sentences at a time. But back to the question of then using the code in word identification. I think the evidence is pretty clear that when words are read by a skilled reader, this phonology, the phonological code that has been acquired, is still functional. It's still active. So the research says that when you read a printed word, you somehow mentally take account of the sound of the word. Automatic phonological activation is the way to think about it. Research that I did some years ago convinced me that that was true. It was at a time in which I think the common view was that what you did when you read was go, especially when you got skilled. This was always interesting to me. Yeah, phonology is important for learning to read. You sound out the words. When you get skilled, boom, you bypass phonology, go directly to meaning from letters. Well, I think that simple story is well established to be wrong by now, but it was prominent when I started doing experiments some years ago on phonology and word reading, and we were able to show phonology effects within 50 milliseconds of reading, within 40 milliseconds of reading a word. So I think that's the nature of the mechanism. Now, the functionality of that code is a little more complex. What is it doing exactly? I think that what it's doing is establishing a word identity. The word letters by themselves, plus the phonology, actually specifies a word identity for which meaning can be quickly associated in a way that just looking at the letters doesn't do that.
So you recognize the meaning by recognizing the sound.
Yes, you recognize. I would even put it a little more strongly.
Okay.
You recognize the letters by recognizing the phonology, and together, that process gives you the meaning.
But that's precisely where there's the greatest ambiguity in the system.
The meaning is where the ambiguity is. The even
between the letters and the sounds.
Well, English is not so hot at that, is it? I mean, English gives you all kinds of ways to pronounce spelling patterns. It's if you draw a line from top to bottom and show the orthographies, the alphabetic orthographies of the world on the top that give you nice correspondences between letters and sounds, you get things like Finnish and Hungarian and Italian and Welsh, lots of others. And way down at the bottom is English, kind of all by itself. French and Danish kind of in between, not so hot themselves, but not as bad as English. Yes, there's a lot of underdeterminism in the sound of English words given the letters. But it's still an alphabetic system. The letters do map on to phonemes. They just happen to often map on to more than one. You put the letters together with other letters. In other words, if it's more than a single letter, a pair of letters, 3 letters, the more letters you add, the more deterministic the pronunciation is. So English is...
If you can recognize those units.
You need to recognize the letters, and you need to compute mappings that go beyond the letters.
So it's not you can't intrinsically know the sound from the code. You have to bring to it other skilled learning that you've acquired and the ability to interpret the letter-sound correspondences in the context of what you're reading.
That's what the learning is about. But once you're skilled, you, on the account that I'm suggesting, is that you are, if not literally, in a very strong figurative sense, seeing the phonology in the word.
I'm totally with you. Now, I had a conversation with Vineski a couple of years ago, just shortly before he died, and he was all over, and we were quite different about this. He thought sub-vocalizations or thinking about it in terms of phonology was a dangerous way to think about it. That it seems to me that we could step back and say that some readers break the sound barrier. They get to a point where they're taking in the meaning from the code in a way that's so much faster than sound, right? You can tell by their progress and their comprehension that their rate of process is faster than they could be sub-vocalizing as a mechanism of getting to that. But I can't imagine that there's any reader other than a deaf reader who doesn't get to whatever proficiency they're getting to by going through sound.
Well, right, and notice there what's really important. We can't speak generally as fast as we can read. Forget about sub-vocalizing. Just we read silently 3 or 4 or 5 words a minute. There's not time. 3, 4 at the end of a day on Friday. Maybe that's slow, but 3 or 4, 5 words a second, and if we couldn't read that quickly if we generated the full phonology. Now that's trying to tell us something. It's trying to tell us that the phonological code, or at least its realization during reading, is not necessarily the same as the full phonological code on spoken words.
The temporal dynamics, the
temporal dynamics are different. It could be abbreviated in some way. In fact, there have been different suggestions. I once suggested that consonants were privileged over vowels in extracting phonology. So the phonological code was prominently consonants as a way of abbreviating the code and kind of compressing it. I'm not sure that's right.
Its roots of origin.
Yeah, but there are some interesting things to say about consonants that do give them privilege. I don't know if I want to go there or not, but let's just say that in skilled reading, the phonology it gets activated is not necessarily the full-blown phonology, but it can be, right? I mean, you can slow down and hear a voice in your head, and that voice can assign stress properly to multisyllabic words. It can even take on an auditory quality that you associate with a particular person. There have been studies that confirm that. So we know that the voice in the head can be a real voice, but when you're doing that, you tend to slow down a little bit to hear the full voice. What I'm saying is that even when you're not doing that, there's phonological coding going on in reading, but it's not completely clear what the form of that is. It's somehow a somewhat paler copy of what you have for pronunciation.
It's an implicate participant, perhaps,
It's
tickling
well,
the comprehensional process, or
it's
recognition of words.
It's solidifying the word identity in a rapid process, that a matter of milliseconds, in which letters connect quickly with sound patterns that they have been associated with in the mind. And that process of putting the letters and sounds together is so rapid that in a skilled reader you can barely pull it apart. It's when you identify the word, this is the word, that string of letters and this pronunciation, that's it, boom, it's all there. And the meaning is, a meaning can be there too at almost virtually the same time. Now, the meaning you need for the context in which the word occurs might take a bit longer to retrieve and get right. But when you're skilled, this set of connections between a word spelling and its pronunciation and its meaning are boom, boom, boom. They're all right there.
And one of the dangers that led to the whole language dimension was generalizing about what learning to read must be like from observing skilled readers. What I'm most interested in everything we do is what's going on in the struggling reader. Deconstructing the various kinds of things that impede the movement from beginning to proficient reading.
Well, let me this is since you haven't given me a good question that I can work this, and I want to work it in right now about comparative reading, because this idea that skilled reading is rather mainly visual is an old idea, and it was once framed this way by Frank Smith in a way that caught my attention, that skilled readers of English read English the way skilled readers of Chinese read Chinese. And that meant skilled reading is visual in both cases, because the assumption was that Chinese was read only visually. And we now know that even Chinese is read by a skilled Chinese reader by taking account of the pronunciation of the characters during reading. But it would be a mistake to assume that that works exactly the same way as it does in an alphabetic system. So we're talking about the code. The code, in fact, is different. The way it's assembled does depend upon the kind of writing system that you have, and within a writing system, the kind of orthography. Chinese is a non-alphabetic system. English, despite its irregularities, is an alphabetic system. So in short, English is more like the very transparent, consistent Italian than it is like Chinese. And you see the differences in how people read the one and the other. It's interesting and fundamental that whether it's an alphabetic system or the Chinese system, that you get phonology come into play, activated during the reading. But its function is not quite the same at the level of detail, because the phonology in Chinese is a whole syllable phonology all at once when the reader retrieves the name of the character, and at the very same time retrieves the meaning of the character. So that the boom 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 that you get in English is the same. It's boom boom in Chinese, orthography and giving you meaning and phonology together. But it does have some differences at a level of detail that we are starting to see in neuroimaging studies, for example, and in studies that we've done in trying to teach people to read Chinese. And my colleagues in Hong Kong, especially my colleague Lehigh Tan, is beginning to find that whereas English children struggle in learning to read through phonology, we know that poor prognosis in reading English is associated with a low level of phonological awareness. In the Chinese case, it's beginning to look like that poor prognosis in reading might be associated with abilities that allow children to write characters. Perhaps visual. The phonological is still relevant, but in the studies it looks like it's a little less important. Now that doesn't mean the reading is different in not using the phonology. It does. It's just that Chinese happens to be a system where it's beginning to look like the fact that it is written by children at the same time it's being read. That is, the learning to write and learning to read go together in Chinese in a way that it does not in English. Simply puts more importance on being able to write characters. That there's a sense in reading the character in which the reader actually uses knowledge about how to produce the character. There might be an analogy in English in that reading a printed word seems to evoke a way to pronounce it. I mean, that you generate the pronunciation given the reading. And when you hear a word in English, you can generate a spelling for it. But it's not the same, right? Children don't spend nearly as much time in American schools practicing writing and learning spelling. The whole concept is quite different. So I think there are differences. When we look across writing systems, the nature of the code is different, and the kind of cognitive support that's required for the code making is a bit different, despite some, I think, really some important similarities. It's one of these things where you can look at something and look at two things and be impressed by how similar they are, and you can be impressed from another stance by how different they are. And the Chinese-English comparison is sort of like that. I'm impressed first by the fact that despite these huge differences, Chinese readers use phonology. But then when I take a closer look, I see how that phonology is implemented in different ways and has different origins and perhaps different consequences for reading skill.
Right. Yeah, I wonder, this is a very interesting aside, the difference in serial linear disambiguation of as confused a code as English, as opposed to, or as distinct from the more co-implicate all-at-once pattern work that may be going on in Chinese orthography.
Right.
Yeah.
And there are differences. It's one of the things we're learning in the cognitive neuroscience of comparative reading is that to read Chinese, one uses more right hemisphere visual processing areas than one sees in reading in alphabetic orthography, and one possibility is that there's a greater demand to extract spatial relations. So there is something about the difference between linear and square spatial relations. What we need to learn more about in that respect is Korean, which is spatially arranged more like Chinese. The letters are distributed in a square rather than in a straight line. It's a two-dimensional array. but of course it's alphabetic. So that's what we need to know more about. It's a system that separates a non-critical feature of alphabetic writing, that it doesn't have to be linear, from a mapping principle, because it is alphabetic. It's not like Chinese.
Right. One of the things that interests me, it connects the dots between the temporal processing that we're talking about, even in the phonology accompanying a good reader, that it may be dilated in some respects, so it's happening faster than it might be if it was spoken. But whether you talk about spoken language and the difference between bad and dad happening in 25 or 30 milliseconds, and just the distinction of the sound components, or you're talking about a speeded up version of that's happening in a reader who's getting phonologically tickled, so to speak. We're talking about whatever the code process and its attendant disambiguation having to output at those kind of rates, aren't we?
I think I had an attention lapse, or maybe we better try this one again, or else I just didn't follow. Or you're
I just want you to know it's about 5:35.
I was figuring we had 7 minutes, that's why I'm speeding up.
Yeah, just time check before-
Yeah, I called my wife, and we can probably stretch it a little bit. Although I told her if I thought it was going to be significantly late, that I would give her another call. We could interrupt it for a call. If you guys want to stay till 6, I can certainly do that, I think.
Thank you. Let's recircle back on this point and then revisit whether how to wrap. I'm particularly interested in this. I mean, it seems as if there's a confused correspondence between letters and sounds that crept into English about 500 years ago, when it re-solidified after the French knocking it off. And there's this whole historical story we've interviewed all the experts in that space about, that results in this confused correspondence put together by a handful of scribes who really didn't even care about English, who didn't necessarily hear the distinctions in the English, who figure out that we're going to map up these letters to combine to make this sound that we don't have enough letters for, and all of this. So it's not God-given, it's not some cognitive scientists and psychologists getting together and figuring out how do we make a code that'll be ecology and efficient for future generations. It's none of that. We have a technology that just happened through a series of accidents of history to be in this condition, in which the confusions that are in it require a young child to process through those confusions and generate this internal experience of language at a certain rate, or it isn't working fast enough for it to be interesting, exciting, comprehensible.
Well, yeah, English writing is a mess, but people do learn to read it, don't they?
Sure they do.
And in fact, it's so easy that some people can't understand why anyone would invent something called a science of reading and worry about things like dyslexia, which surely must be so exotic that they're beyond normal understanding. I don't know whether the reading failures with English are due mainly to the irregularity of the writing system. When people have done studies comparing, and there haven't been many good ones, this is a case where we're not quite sure what the right answer is. We don't want to pretend that we do. Studies are hard to do because if you compare a nice transparent orthography like German, which isn't perfect, but it's better than English. And I mention German because studies have been done in German. Those comparisons suggest that German children use the code better, do the letter to sound mapping better. And when you ask, as a study has, whether that's due to the difference in the mapping, or could it be a difference in how reading is taught, because in Germany phonics is taught, and in England, which provided a comparison, it's not, or at least it wasn't in this particular case. Their conclusion is sort of in between. Even when they compared a school that taught phonics, you still found these differences, which that you're then tempted to attribute to the difference between the mapping regularity of German and the irregularity of English. So I think there's a residual factor that's about the writing system. But we don't have a lot of really good comparisons about how instruction can support learning so that despite its irregularities, people can learn to handle English. I mean, how did you and I learn to read English if it's so hard? I mean, how did we get to be able to read 200 words a minute or whatever our normal pace is? It can't be that hard, or that many people wouldn't do it. So there's something potentially easy about it. When children can't read, the question is why? And I don't think we still quite know the answer. It could be that we don't do good instruction. It could be that English orthography is tough unless it has just the right instruction. It could be both of those, and it could be something else. I certainly think we ought to recognize that there are biological factors in some kinds of reading disability, and those could be distributed in ways that we don't know yet across the world. It could turn out that at the biological level, all languages are susceptible to having dyslexia. We know about the studies comparing Italian children, Italian adults actually, and Italian, French, and English readers, and finding similarities and differences in the patterns of disability, so that the conclusion is that there is a universal pattern, but the dyslexia gets manifest in different ways depending on the writing system. Well, it's not depending on the writing system, excuse me, because Italian and English and French are all the same system. They just vary in how consistent the mapping is.
That's huge, that variation, even though they're the same.
It's huge. It is. Well, it's.
The way you said it was like, well, you know, there's
No, but I want to urge us to see the difference between English and Italian as less than the difference between English and Chinese.
Sure. Yeah.
There's a chasm in one case and a relatively small difference in the other. So in fact, put it this way, isn't it interesting that a relatively small difference between Italian and English can produce so much difference? They do work on the same principle. English just makes things more complex by having more multiple mappings. But that difference, which sounds like my point is, it sounds like a quantitative difference, and it is, right? How many phonemes associate with a given grapheme in each system? And that number is greater in English than Italian. So it's just quantitative, right?
But that quantitative
and it makes makes a big difference. It makes a big difference, right? I mean, quantitative aspects count in the brain. The number of connections you're forced to make can dictate the amount of interference and confusion you're going to have. So I think that's my point. Quantitative considerations do matter, not just the qualitative ones. When you go from English to Chinese, you're going a qualitative difference. Those matter too. But even the quantitative ones within the family of alphabetic systems makes a big difference.
Excellent. Good. Let's switch tapes real quick. Looking at developmental neuroscience that's watching how children from birth are developing extended language capabilities, extensive language capabilities, depending upon the quality of vowel punching in motherese. I mean, we've got this track that's happening, that the quality of the language, the distinction, the richness, the degree of affect engagement. I mean, kids that listen to television are not getting the same kind of language nutrient that kids that are being engaged with. We know there's a difference between whether they're in taciturn families that are being do this, do this, don't do that, instruction driven as opposed to open-ended, more turn-taking, rich language conversations. All these things are changing the readiness trajectory and the background, it seems, that children come into this reading challenge with. Yeah. So to say that it's just the code, no. But go ahead, you're about.
So, well, no. The question is, then what, right? What are we going to see a change in preparedness for literacy? Are we going to see a change in literacy acquisition as these when we understand these kinds of variables better? When I say change, I guess I have in mind the eventual lack of reading activities at the expense of television. I guess I should put the other way around. The reliance on video and television as opposed to reading and conversation. That certainly could make a difference. But we're already seeing these kind of differences you're talking about among speaking communities, among families, among larger communities, and the kinds of conversations that go on between parents and children and so on. And I think that needs to be understood. Its consequences for literacy need to be understood better. I believe is commonly assumed that you needed to have lots of rich oral environment, a rich spoken language environment in order to prepare children for literacy. And I don't think that argument is convincing. I don't know if it has solid data, but the fact is, when you start to learn to read, you're doing something a little bit different, and you've got to learn how your writing system encodes your language. You can't just transfer automatically all the wonderful things that you've experienced in conversation. What you can transfer, I think this is important, is a feeling that it's fun to use language, and that reading is another way of using language, and maybe you will like that too. But it turns out that a lot of people don't read very much, and they're perfectly fine and wonderful with language. They have great conversations and tell great stories and hear great stories, and literacy is not something that they're either very interested in or very good at. So I think we have to keep in mind the likelihood that literacy is erected on spoken language, but the variability in language background might not be as relevant as it sometimes seems, because no matter what the background is, you have to learn something new. It's a new kind of learning to attend to these little squiggles on a page, absolutely meaningless in themselves, and use them to construct messages. So getting to the meaning is and getting a system that's going to support getting to the meaning is going to be work for most children, despite the fact that some kids, and it's true, we need to take into account the fact that some children virtually teach themselves to read. It's just that we can't make that as our we can't make a big deal out of that. We can't make that our this is what it's like model. It's interesting that some children can do that, and we need to understand that better. But most children have to be taught at least a little bit about how the code works, and how their written language basically encodes their spoken language. That's the key thing to learn.
Right. Well, there's absolutely, clearly, there's no question that reading involves learning things that go way beyond or go beyond oral language. Is there a necessary but thereafter insufficient level of language processing infrastructure that's built, that's grown in relation to a certain speed, richness, complexity, and emotional engagement with language that benefits, or if it's weak, makes more difficult the reading challenge?
Well, I think literacy supports a lot of that, right? I mean, if you've got a rich language background and you learn to read, as you become literate and reading becomes a routine way of using language, I think you're going to actually build up the way you you're going to modify the way you treat spoken language. The reading does become just another language modality when you become good at it, and I think it affects the spoken language. But again, I think the question of whether things that happen to you, well, let me rephrase that, the things that you experience as a child in your language community, the kinds of conversations you have with other people, the way that affects learning how to code your language is probably remote. It's not clear how it makes an effect. So I think that's something we've got to learn more about. If it does make a difference, we need to understand it better. Certainly it can make a difference in motivation. Certainly having books around makes a difference. All these things matter. And if you can take a shortcut to breaking the code, as some children can, parents can help, you're making a quick progress in learning to read, but you still have to learn the code.
I think we talked on the phone real briefly about a metaphor we play with of the player piano, where when you think of the keys like phonemes and the scroll like the code, and that if the scrolls, you have to have all the right keys, and these have to be moving in the right time sync in order for the resulting play to sound like anything that you recognize. If it doesn't have the right keys, or if the scroll is moving too slow, then it doesn't make sense, right? So
that's an interesting metaphor. Sorry for interrupting, but thinking about the contrasting metaphor is that the kid plays the piano himself and always hits a lot of wrong notes. So the player piano model is sort of the more passive view of this process. So in which when you're good, you don't have to attend a lot to make a lot of decisions. Is it this word or that word? Is it this letter than that letter? You don't have to do the work and take the risk of hitting the wrong note. It is much more like the player piano. That work is being done for you, and then you can decide what it means and whether you like it played this way or that way.
You're enjoying music, or you're not enjoying music, but you're not worried about whether this key is being hit the right time, the right way.
Right.
Yeah. So in that sense, I mean, one of the things that's really interesting in the phonological dimensions of this conversation is that the kind of distinctions the brain has to learn in order to participate in oral language, in terms of the granularity of distinction, seem to be of a different order than the kind of distinctions we have to be capable of processing in order to map sound and print together.
Well, I'm not sure. The spoken language requires lots of distinctions. I mean, it requires more distinctions than reading. I mean, we've got lots of phonemes in English, 45, depending on your dialect, and those are already abstractions, right? I mean, underlying those 45 phonemes or so is a much larger set of phones that vary depending upon where you are in a word, where they are in a word. There are a lot of phonetic distinctions, a lot of phonological distinctions that have to be mastered. I think the mystery is that those things are mastered so easily.
They're not ambiguous in the same way, are they at all?
Well, I don't know. Are they? Is the sound in slip at the beginning the same as the sound at the end of pots? We pretend it's not by inventing these categories called phonemes, but the sounds are going to show variability, and yet it doesn't seem to be much of an issue. It's mastered. The range of sounds, the production mechanisms. We're biologically all ready to perceive and produce speech. And it's really complex, and we do it anyway. And it's not that hard unless there's some biological reason for it to be hard.
But do we pay attention to we might say that our brain is learning to differentiate the signals that make it able to background process word recognition. But does it require us ever to become, it seems like children go right into meaning transparency very fast.
Sure.
Right? And that the kind of attention to details and the variation in sound is it's of a different order.
It's all running in the background, and it's not necessary. The child goes to meaning, the phonology. The phonology is transparent in the sense that you look right through it to get the meaning.
Or you hear right through it.
And in reading, it's just, that's not the case. In reading, the letters are not transparent. You can't look through the letters and see the meaning until you become really good at reading. But in the child's natural language development, the phonology is transparent. You look through it and you get the meaning. And that it's complex and it's all running in the background and it's all developing very rapidly and very easily. It all becomes rather different, doesn't it, when you have a second language. So all of this phonological transparency that's so easy in your first language because you're a child, because I think it's because you're biologically ready to learn a language. If you learn a second language, especially older as an adult, it's different if you learn it along with your first language. There's nothing transparent about the phonology. You can't look through it and get the meaning. You struggle with it. You try to parse a spoken stream into words so you can find words that you can look up because you might know a few words. But it's a completely different, less implicit process. I mean, the learning your native language is all implicit, easy, biologically enabled.
We're differentiating what we're wired to do.
Yeah.
Rather than having to build wiring that isn't there.
Yeah, right. So, yeah, there's a little bit of rewiring done for reading. The brain has to learn to use new networks, to build new networks and use them to handle written language.
Good. Well, we're at 2 minutes of 6 and I want to keep our promise. This has been a wonderful conversation. I mean, there's so many places I wish we could take a half a day and drill really deep into a lot of these things.
Well, that would be fun. But
yeah.
you have a schedule.
You do too.
I don't mind being late for dinner. I'll make the opera, so don't worry about that.
We're going to an opera.
Well, the first dinner,
for an excuse
first
now.
dinner, and then the opera. I always prefer to have opera first and then the dinner, but my wife can't wait that
What did
long.
you think of the latest NAEP scores?
Well, it's nice that they're getting higher. They are, aren't they?
1/4 of 1%.
Well, it's
1/4 of 1% in 4th grade up, 1/4 of 1% in 8th grade down.
right. Well, what goes up must come down, where the NAEP is concerned.
We're talking about this continual flat line. I mean, 65% of the children in this country are reading below proficiency, and despite the work at IES to try to recalibrate what the meaning of basic and proficiency and all this is, the general consensus still is if you're below proficiency, what that means is that your ability to read transparently, to be able to get right at the meaning of things that you're reading, and have the freedom to be metacognitively reflective and creatively applying what it is you're reading, at the level the curriculum is assuming you should be, you're below that.
Right.
Most of the kids in this country are below that.
It's a bummer, isn't it?
What is that? What's the collateral psychological consequences of protracted feeling underwater that most of our children are feeling?
That's a good question, and I don't know the answer. I don't know what it feels like to be underwater for very long. I can't stand being underwater for more than about 10 seconds myself.
Yeah.
And I think it would be terribly debilitating to be underwater for a long time.
I mean, this is what seems to be at the root of
and
the
that's what this problem is not going to be solved. I mean, by better phonological awareness training. I worry that we've got a little bit of the right answer from the kind of research that's gone on in the last 15 years, but that it's so incomplete that when it fails, we're going to get son of whole language.
Yes.
It's going to come back because
you set up the shadow.
Yes, because this will fail. There are some things that need to be done. The code, teaching the code directly is still not, I think, done seriously enough, although it's in the right direction. A lot of effort is going into pre-literacy training of phonological awareness, which I am not sure is a good investment of resources compared with making sure that beginning reading instruction focuses on the code. You can learn about phonological awareness at the same time that you learn to read if the instruction focuses on that.
Arguably, it's the best time because that's when it's being introduced to the distinctions you otherwise don't have to hear.
Yes. And then, assuming that everything could be cooking along just wonderfully in the first grade when children are learning to read, and then the obstacles come a little bit later, the fourth grade slump that everybody talks about. Well, this thing I've been working on this afternoon was about teaching word meanings. Because English has all this irregularity, the models of reading that you need to make word reading be effective in this kind of orthography, those models require semantics in a way that the models that explain reading Italian don't. In other words, you can, because you can't decode reliably letters to sounds, having some of that go on while you are getting support from, this looks like a word that has this meaning, and that grabs the rest of what you need.
I mean, how the morphemic qualities and context have to participate along with
the context has to participate, but also, you're right, also you can get, if you can partially identify a word candidate from a few letters, even if you can't decode it, then you recognize it as possibly a word that you might know. That's semantics having an influence. So here's the upshot of what I'm saying. Suppose it turns out that, for the reasons we talked about before, that English is hopelessly complex for all children to be able to learn reliably, even with pretty good instruction. I'm not necessarily buying that, but suppose for a moment it's true. If that is true, what else do you need to get good at reading in America? The answer is you have to know lots of words. You have to have a large vocabulary. You have to have something to help bootstrap words that you can't decode. And you might need more than that, but you got to have at least that. And so that's a piece of the thing that's missing.
That ties back to the early childhood trajectory, doesn't it? It seems like there's an explosion of vocabulary development around 3 or 4 years old. It sets a trajectory into vocabulary acquisition.
That's right. Yeah, and so vocabulary growth is huge at that age. It has the opportunity to have big growth spurts with literacy because you're exposed to a lot of words. And I think it does, but there are just huge differences in, and this goes back to the pre-literacy environment and the continued environment during literacy years. How many opportunities do you have to learn lots of words? And of course, it's not just word forms, is it? It's meanings, it's concepts, it's the whole, it's all of learning that then does really become relevant for reading achievement. So we're obviously missing that. If we're having failures in schools in the 8th grade, I don't think we want to think that it's all about decoding. Even though I have said, and I will say again, that if you look closely at kids not comprehending well, even in the 8th grade, you're going to find them having coding problems. But they also apparently are not able to do much to make up for that by having good vocabulary knowledge and other things.
Exactly, but this is where the psychology part cuts in. When we start talking to psychologists, what happens to children who start to develop a pre-conscious emotional aversion to the feeling of confusion because of just beating their head against the wall of being confused during trying to take off to read? Right. What happens to them?
Yeah. Well, that is the question. And if they've had failure before, we've talked about it. If you begin with failure, and especially if it comes at just the right time, it could really ruin everything for you. And even momentary failures can affect the immediate context for learning. I mean, you might actually fail to learn something in the next 30 minutes. 30 minutes out of a life isn't much, but if you miss those 30 minutes, the next time you might miss something else. We see it. I don't think we appreciate how important that cumulative knowledge is in reading. We see it clearly in mathematics. We know that, if you haven't been there for addition, you're not going to get multiplication, and so on. I think reading, it's less true and less obvious both, but it's true enough that it can make a difference. And then it has this extra property that you've been talking about, that the failure is going to inhibit the interest and the motivation and the attention and all kinds of cognitive events that go on during reading. So it's a problem. And we know children start avoiding reading when they experience failure. And even when they're good enough, to go through, even when they're good enough, right, they wind up not choosing to do it and avoiding homework and getting by with the minimal effort, and that's going to produce falls in 8th grade NAP scores.
Yeah, the coping strategies of how you deal with that early stuff. Even if you do break through to an instrumental ability with the skill, what is the residual psychological effect on you about school and how you feel about yourself as a mind?
There are always other things to do in life, and if you're not good at school, why bother?
Yeah, well, that's what it seems like anyway, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Wow. I'd like to keep the door open because we're not that far apart, and maybe talk again if you're open to that as things develop in our project. And I certainly
Sure, I am. I enjoyed the phone conversation with you, and this wasn't too bad.
Okay.